and I'll start to prepare the live stream, okay? Okay, we are now live, Blue.
Ok, thank you. Obrigado, Catarina. So, vamos começar? Tá bem. Okay, everything okay? Yes. Okay, so hi you all, and welcome to this webinar of the project UBIEXP. The UBIEXP project is the acronym of the political philosophy and the epistemology of basic income experiments, hosted at the Center for Ethics, Politics and Society at the University of Minho in Braga, Portugal. And this webinar is let's say, a partial alternative or a partial solution to the UBIEXP International Conference on UBI experiments, which was going to take place this July in Braga, in Portugal, but that has been postponed for until the next July for obvious reasons. By now then, we are organizing this series of online events, among which this is the first event, the first seminar, but stay tuned and keep checking our webpage for the international conference next July, which the call for papers, if I'm not wrong, is February 2022, and for other upcoming events we are already preparing. So what's this seminar, what's this webinar about? We are firstly wondering ourselves to what extent are the basic income experiments we are conducting in our cities or in our countries are a proper way for advancing the cause of basic income, or at least the idea of basic income. Are they, on the one hand, a sort of a first step towards a full implementation of a basic income policy in our countries, or on the other hand, are they just a way to entertain, to some sense, ourselves, or to distract our attention from lobbying our national or regional or municipal governments? So despite the controversial or the collected evidences for all of these experiments, none, which is a fact, none of our countries or the countries where this experiment has been implemented has implemented a real basic income policy, and that's a fact. And we are proposing, we are wondering why. What's the reason why, if we are pretending that the experiment or collecting in seats and robust evidences from experiments, once we have collected them, these evidences are not enough, let's say, to convince our governments to implement basic income. So following this question or this concern, is there any kind of trade-off, let's say, when considering experimenting instead of directly pushing our governments to roll out these kind of measures or implementing a basic income? So in some, basic income is an object of a study or is a policy goal in itself? That's the main questions behind or underlying this seminar. So to respond these kind of questions or any other else that could been raising during the seminar, we have invited Jamie Cook and Amy Castro, and we would like to thank them for joining us this afternoon. Jamie is head of Royal Society for Encouragement of Arts, Manufactures and Commerce in Scotland. He is particularly involved in RECA's projects and initiatives related with basic income, for sure, inclusive growth, and the role of cities. And he's one of the, let's say, architects of the Glasgow UBI pilot. Amy Castro Baker is assistant professor at the University of Pennsylvania. She's working on in the intersection, let's say, between economic mobility, granted income programs, and the relationship between social policies and different gender, race, and housing issues. And along with Stacey West, she is in charge of designing and assessing the impact results of the Stockton Economic Empowerment Demonstration Program. And unfortunately, we have invited Bernard Neumaker. Bernard is a professor at the University of Freiburg, and he is head of the Freebies Institute for Basic Income Studies. Unfortunately, he was vaccinated yesterday afternoon, and he is not able, or he is not feeling well enough to join us this afternoon. We hope he's recovering very soon. So once again, thank you all. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. The room is open, and I would like to start by asking Jamie a couple of questions, and then to Amy to ask her a couple of questions more. Thank you for your assistance. Jamie, it's been said that the Scottish experiment, well, the Scottish still designing experiment has received a large support from political parties or from political spectrum. The Scottish National Party, the Scottish Labour, and even the Green Party are supporting the basic income somehow in different grades, in different ways. So, but my question would be, what beyond the political party support? Is there any civil society or social movements or social platforms supporting the design or fighting for implementing a basic income experiment in Scotland? Because it seems to me, at least, that the decision of conducting an experiment in Scotland is mostly framed by political parties in a particular scenario, which is the, let's say, the possible or the new possible future for Scotland independence, the Brexit issue, etc. So a political scenario could facilitate to discuss more in a more vivid way these kind of solutions, including basic income. So I was wondering whether the support of implementing an experiment came mostly from political parties, or is there any kind of civil society coalition pushing for it as well?
Thanks, Brew. And yeah, it's a really exciting time here in Scotland in terms of the progress and the developments around interest in basic income. I mean, really from even looking at 2016, where interest started in the first place, and there was very little progress, to today, where we're now in a position, as you say, 4 out of the 5 main Scottish political parties represented in the Scottish Parliament publicly expressed support for basic income in some shape or form. We now are in a position where I would say that the majority of members of the Scottish Parliament are certainly open to the idea, if not actually active supporters, including quite a few in the Scottish Government. And probably most vocally of all, Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister of Scotland, who recently described, basic income as the idea whose time had come and that she would introduce for Scotland if she could. And as I'll come back to, unfortunately, she can't at this point. But I think what's really interesting, and for me, the defining feature of progress in Scotland, is that it has come from civic society, from academia, and from local politics, not from national politics. So the buy-in, the excitement that we see today is because of that drive from communities. And I think that, for me, has been the defining feature and the really exciting aspect of this. The kind of beginning interest in basic income in Scotland was through the work of local councils, local authorities. So Fife Council to the north of Edinburgh first looked at this very end of 2015 in terms of what they called their Fairer Fife Commission. So this was an external body looking at what Fife could do to make the place a better place for its citizens. And basic income was one of the recommendations to try that in a town in Fife. And then seeing organisations like my own, the RSA, which is a charity, a think tank and a membership organisation. And then the kind of growth of local organisations. So Basic Income Network Scotland, the BN affiliates, which has been at the driving force of much of the development that's taking place, but also the interest from anti-poverty groups, from I suppose people who'd maybe been involved in the first Scottish independence referendum in 2014, who were looking for new ideas for a new Scotland, and also across the country, disability groups, community activist groups, and many academics. And I think it's that broad coalition that has been the really exciting driving force for this. In Scotland, as you've touched on, the Constitution, whether Scotland will consider voting on independence or not, can be quite a defining feature, quite a dividing feature, as you can imagine in a lot of political debate. And actually, although, and I think we can explore this in more detail, the idea of an independent Scotland gives a natural framing space where you could deliver a basic income. Actually, it's an idea that has been able to be engaged with from both sides of that debate. And I think that's been really critical. It's not just an issue for independence. This is an issue of how could you deliver this within the United Kingdom if it were to continue. And I think that's been, in a sense, bolstered by the support that's growing across the rest of the UK. So the First Minister of Wales has committed to a basic income experiment of some sort now. There's an interest across England and Northern Ireland as well. So for me, it's always been important that we don't allow it to get bogged down in party politics too much. But of course, for delivery, for taking this forward, the buy-in, the interest, and the challenge of political parties is critical. And I think it's a really promising space to be able to look at such a cross-party support and interest now.
Okay, sorry, I was mute. So okay, so then I thought that the framing stuff of the Scottish experiment was more, let me use this word to emphasize what I mean, determined by political framing, by political parties, by political equilibrium between Scotland and the rest of UK, etc., and particularly determined by or influenced by the debate on the independence. And my second question was directly related with this political framing, and the question was related with how are you planning to evaluate or assess the impact results of your experiment, or what do you think about that, the prospects of the evaluation of your experiments? I mean, assuming that it was a real political party output, your experiments, are you expecting to have to fight, in scientific terms, in order to depoliticize the result, or at least the way in which you communicate the results? Because there is always this tension. Experiments are an output of the political debate or political equilibrium. So as being so, the results, or at least the way in which we communicate the results, might be threatened by the same political equilibrium. So I was wondering whether are you concerned about of that possible danger?
So I think there's a debate within the kind of basic income world and ecosystem in Scotland about experiments. So I probably should be upfront with my perspective, which is the experiments, and I'll go into a bit of detail about what was proposed by the Scottish Government, will not happen. I can't see any way that they will be delivered in the way that the feasibility study reported them. And I'm very much of the opinion that I don't think they are what we need at this stage. So to give a bit of context, the Scottish Government commissioned, put £250,000 into a feasibility study into the idea of running basic income experiments in Scotland involving 4 local authorities, local councils. So Glasgow is the biggest city, Edinburgh is the capital, Fife, who I mentioned already, and then North Ayrshire, another part of Scotland. And that took a few years worth of engaging with stakeholders, undertaking research, producing some reports into the barriers and the challenges that existed, and reported its final report last year, roughly May, June 2020. And some of the work that was carried out within that feasibility study was fantastically important and will be used across the UK. The Welsh will use it and partners elsewhere, because it analysed the relationship around social security. So the United Kingdom's in a funny position where we have devolution of power to a certain extent. There's a Scottish Parliament, there's a Welsh Parliament. However, in Scotland, for example, the Scottish Government has control of about 15% of the social security budget and limited control of taxation powers within that. So the reality is that the Scottish Government cannot deliver a basic income experiment of the level that they then proposed, as I'll come to, without the buy-in of the United Kingdom Government, of the Department of Work and Pensions around benefit support, obviously around impacts with taxation and so on. So it is impossible. Going back to what I said about Nicola Sturgeon saying she would deliver it tomorrow if she could, the reality is she cannot do that without UK government buy-in. And I think it's fair to say that currently the UK government are not open to and considering basic income as an option for social security. So that work was really important because it started to open up the interactions. There was also some financial feasibility work, which again was a very useful piece of work. My critique or my concern about it was that the modelling used was very much only under existing powers, which is understandable, but then therefore means that effectively any sort of way of paying for basic income solely comes down to income tax, which it came back with some quite high figures around raises to income tax to pay for this. Whereas, for example, the report we published at the RSA a couple of years ago, proposing a basic income system for Scotland, started to look at other ways of paying for basic income as well, which started to spread that cost. The final recommendation of the feasibility study was for Scotland to carry out an experiment with 17,000 residents of Scotland. Of those 17,000, they would be split into 2 cohorts, one receiving a higher level of basic income and one a lower level, in order to compare whether the different levels made a significant difference, with another 17,000 in a control group. And this would be spread in different parts of Scotland. Now, this would obviously be a huge experiment in terms of size and scope. It would also be a huge experiment in terms of cost to run that over a 3-year period, plus the building and the evaluation period at the end. I think it's worth, and you can download the report from the Basic Income Scotland website. They did start to put into work around how they would evaluate, making sure that that was built in from the beginning and was part of the capacity building process. All of that was fantastic. But I think the likelihood of it happening, given the lack of buy-in from the UK government, was pretty much zero. We then obviously have Brexit, which is throwing up huge economic challenges for Scotland. We have the debate around independence, which creates huge constitutional upheaval. Would you run a potentially 5-year process if you knew that potentially in the middle of that you're going to have significant change? And of course, the impact of COVID. I would say that the COVID-19 pandemic has shifted the debate in Scotland around basic income by probably 3 to 5 years. So it's gone from an idea that, yes, was desirable to one that feels essential. And so for me, this comes back to where I feel in a Scottish context, this sort of large-scale experiment actually wouldn't be beneficial to us at this point. When we're getting to a stage where the policymakers are calling for basic income as a policy, I think actually a large-scale multi-year experiment would be a potential real barrier to progress. I think it would delay decisions. You're not going to introduce a policy if you've committed to testing it for several years. I think, as has been discussed in other settings, I'm sure we'll talk about today, Obviously, there are limitations to what you can prove with an experiment anyway, and there's already data and evidence that we can tap into from around the world. And I think it therefore wouldn't be a sensible option at this stage, even if it were possible, which I really don't think it is. But I think it did help to really shape that decision. So although we haven't carried out the experiment itself, and interestingly, I often get email inquiries from a lot of media sources saying, can I get the results from the Glasgow experiment? What happened? And you have to explain to them it never did happen and was never intended to have happened at this stage. It changed that dialogue. It brought the concept to the forefront of people's minds, and it meant that when COVID happened, there was already a lot of the preparatory work that allowed politicians to feel that this was a sensible stage. Now, the one thing I would say as a caveat to that is I do think there's a space and an opportunity in Scotland for us to look at small scale, less experiments, more just the tests. So this, for me, these would have two options. One is to show the delivery mechanisms. So how do we test how we would actually get a basic income into people's pockets? I think that could be a useful process. I think also the human impact of basic income is the critical bit now. I always talk about from the Ontario experiments, the impact of starting to see what people were going to do with the money. That was a powerful aspect. Humans a Basic Income program that Jessica Olin put together, a really powerful way of engaging people with that human impact. I think there's a space for that sort of really small scale, tiny groups, not claiming that this is going to prove anything, but that it allows us to capture some of the richness of real human interaction. And interestingly, I mentioned that the Welsh government have very publicly and repeatedly committed to running experiments now after their elections. And I'm in discussions around some of the ways we can support them with that. They're talking about a very targeted experiment, probably with young people leaving the care system within Wales. That's something that we've discussed in Scotland as well. Now, I think as long as you're very clear that this isn't expected to be a universal, large-scale, full basic income, if it's a way to test some of those human interactions, I think there's a space for those. But for me, that large-scale, 17,000 people was a fantastic piece of work, but is not the way that we'll see progress being made in Scotland, although it could well be a useful resource for other countries and other areas to make use of if they're in a different place from where we are.
Okay, thanks. Thank you, Jamie. Very, very interesting how how the political realm or political scenario is mixing with all of that. So let's move to United States, to Stockton. Hi, Amy. Pretty the same. The SEED program seems to be, I won't be wrong, but it seems to be a project particularly designed and even support and even implemented by the mayor TOP's decision on an unilateral decision, let's say. So I was wondering whether there was as well in the Scottish case, is there any sort of popular support behind the experiment, or other way said, the experiment has been somehow perceived historically for movements or platforms or grassroots movements or wherever claiming for implementing or testing an experiment on basic income, or the other way around, it should be considered just a mayor TOP's decision, a unilateral decision?
Oh, such a good question. And thank you so much for having me. I'm struck listening to Jamie speak how similar, I didn't realize until I was actually listening to you answer those questions, how similar our contexts are and sort of where the popular support is coming from. So, first thing I'll say, with regards to Stockton, it's sort of mayor-led, or it was mayor-led, because Mayor Michael Tubbs was not reelected. He actually lost his reelection bid this past year. So the experiment was actually set up separate from the mayor's office in a separate nonprofit so that it could continue on should something happen, like he's not reelected. So, one of the things that's been really exciting is that it was spearheaded first by philanthropy. And so the goal was, as sort of being the first modern US experiment, around basic income in the US, was keeping it outside of government at first in terms of actual dollars to sort of test the waters a little bit. So in terms of political feasibility in the US, trying to get something passed first through government is a pretty uphill battle, particularly during the Trump era, which we are now exiting, of course. And so the idea was first, like, what would happen if philanthropy stepped out first and really funded this? So it was sort of mayor led, but the dollars were coming from private donors, essentially. But then what has happened is we sort of have hit this tipping point where we now have very robust public dollars going into a series of replication experiments across the US, which my team is leading out of Penn. So all that being said, I could talk details about that, ad nauseum, which I won't. But I think one of the things that's most exciting is that the pressure or the momentum around basic income in the United States is really coming bottom up. So it's coming from mayors, city council folks, advocacy. Really, it's the end result of many decades of activism on behalf of both people in the community organizing space and also in the academic and research space. And so while in the press, it sort of seems like it just appeared overnight, it actually didn't, right? Like, our work is here because there have been many other people doing that careful groundwork of narrative shift and political organizing for many, many decades. So we've kind of hit this tipping point because it's not just about COVID. It's also about the fact that the majority of US households have not recovered from the Great Recession. So people have lost tremendous amounts of wealth, tremendous amounts of financial stability, and it's sort of, it's really shifting the conversation. There's a lot I could say about that, but I'll wait and see what other questions you might have. So when I think about sort of what Stockton has done, on the one hand, it's an experiment, right? We wanted to see what would happen around specific hypotheses. But on the other, it was very carefully designed to push on public narrative. So we're pretty upfront about what we're doing with this experiment. We intentionally had a politically propulsive sample of 25 people who had consented to sort of share their stories in the press as they were going through the experiment. And of course, their data was kept separate from the main treatment group. That was a very intentional decision on our part to pair that type of public engagement with an RCT, because the context that we're in the United States, we can have the best experiment in the world. We can run amazing modeling. We can do all the testing we want to see, how a UBI or basic income would work. But at the end of the day, if we don't engage public discourse around shame, blame, deservedness, tying people's, value and worth to what they produce in the market, we're just going to shift those shame and blame narratives from the welfare state to basic income or to something else. So the experiment's really designed to sort of generate that, robust empirical data for policymakers so we can figure out how to actually implement things, what the architecture needs to look like, those types of things, while at the same time engaging in a public conversation around the social contract, which is long overdue in the US. And we're taking sort of a similar approach with the other experiments that we're running right now.
Sorry, I forgot I was mute.
No worries.
Yeah, that's the question I was going to or the second question I prepared. To which extent all of this movement across the United States, for instance, Mayo for granted income, or even the pronouncements or the announcements or the support received by Zuckerberg or Elon Musk or all these kind of people, famous people that has been expressing their support for basic income or different models of basic income. To what extent all of this momentum has contributed to advance the idea of testing or convincing people or majors of implementing basic income experiments. So that's the other big issue, how the COVID pandemic has hit the fight and the discussion of not just on basic income, but on the experiments, which are two different and quite different things. And that's the other point I wanted to stress. First, you have pointed out quite similar issues. First, mostly regarding the US context, there are some natural, precisely because of the COVID pandemic, we are experiencing, or we are seeing natural, what we can be considered natural experiments. For instance, the checks that the Republican administration delivered to millions of inhabitants in the United States, which could be considered as a natural experiment. And I was wondering whether is some social scientist or someone there aiming to research the impact of these new pretty unconditional measures. This is not only measure experiencing in the United States, but also in Europe, where thousands of millions of euros has been granted to directly and mostly on a conditional basis to the citizens. That's the first question. Is there anyone else aiming to research on that? And secondly, which could be more a controversial question. Okay, Jamie,
I like controversial questions. Go for it.
Sure.
Those are way more fun.
Exactly.
Jamie, you pointed out a very interesting point, at least to me, which is that the experiments are gathering some important, let's say, qualitative results, which weren't considered, the most important ones a few years ago, because everybody, including me, were, absolutely focused on the quantitative results, particularly the labor market. So we as a basic income community, or as a scholars anyway, we have conducted a lot of experiments already, and we have demonstrated that all of them, somehow are collecting some pretty good results regarding the qualitative indicators, for instance, stress relief, or well-being, or subjective well-being, happiness, etc. But on the other hand, the press, media, and particularly politics, which are in most cases the ones funding the projects, are still strongly and mostly interested in quantitative impacts, particularly on labor market impacts. So there is a gap there. There is a trade-off. We, as a social scientists, as a basic income community, as a scholars in general, as a people who is concerned about basic income, are pretty sure that basic income, or most of basic income experiments, are collecting quite positive results in its qualitative dimensions, and not in their quantitative, particularly on labor markets. But public opinion and particular politics are still mostly focused on labor market impact. So there is a gap there, which solution seems pretty hard to me. So I would like to hear your opinion on that couple of issues. The COVID natural experiments resulting from COVID, and this gap between qualitative and quantitative analysis, results analysis, and how can we manage that to convince our government? Whoever want to start.
I jump in.
Go ahead, Jamie.
Is that okay? Yeah, no, I think Jeff's made some good points in the chat around some of this as well. I think, in terms of that qualitative side, so we're kind of lucky in Scotland, and I am very conscious that the political context here does give us an advantage. So the discussion around basic income in Scotland has first and foremost been driven by an idea of social justice, and therefore about creating, I said Fife did this for a fairer Fife. That was the driver. It wasn't, of course, it was tied into the economy and work, but it was first and foremost about the idea of social justice. And therefore, that does give different requirements for success, I suppose, in a sense. People are more willing to have a broader consideration of what would be worth, what are the trade-offs. I think it has grown in terms of the importance of economic insecurity, of working insecurity that's played into it. One of the things that was often held up as a contrast with the United States was the idea that maybe in the US there had been a stronger push and focus on, the impact of new technology on work, so automation and AI. That hadn't been discussed in Scotland, which was a real failing point, because actually automation and AI are also issues of social justice. It's many of the communities who were most impacted by previous industrial change will be impacted by the next round as well. So it has broadened out. I think that's created a space for us to be able to start to look at that qualitative side, because actually it's the area that starts to engage people in the feeling of change. Now, we do have the data we can put in. We have economic modelling that we can stick in. We can, we can make some of those arguments, and we can see where that comes into play. But I think actually fundamentally it's coming back to that idea of a social contract that Amy touched on. That for me has been the big drivers. The things that have caught people's attention are resetting that social contract, recognizing that we are not suggesting this is a magical panacea to all our problems. This is the foundation we build upon. That has had a real resonance. I think the other aspect is the language of investment. We are investing in people. And this is where COVID-19 has been a massive shift and change, because we've seen that money can be spent. The idea, we've certainly in the UK, we've been living through austerity for several years. There is no magic money tree, we were famously told by a prime minister. It turns out there's lots of magic money trees when there needs to be. And arguably, looking at some of the UK context just now, that money, when it's going to some of your pals, is that's an entire forest that's available to you. So the concept that money can't be spent or created or used has really been held up for scrutiny over the last week, and quite rightly. What's the point of a government if it cannot respond to the kind of crisis we've been going through? But I think it also has raised the challenge around the systems that exist. So we've been talking about the failings of the UK social security system. For a lot of the population, they don't come into contact with that system. They're never due to see it. So when the media reports it as overly generous and, full of scroungers, that can have a resonance. Over this, we've seen the furlough system in the United Kingdom, where money has been given directly to people to keep them away from work and directly to businesses. Now, had that been a basic income, it would have been implemented quicker, fairer, and there wouldn't be the massive gaps in provision that we saw, particularly for self-employed people. It's brought people into contact with the universal credit system, and they've realised it's a disaster. It can't work. It's not fit for purpose. And actually, good, hard-working people who supposedly have been told it's being misused realise that it doesn't work. And I think that is a real opportunity for change, because suddenly that experience of people, and therefore bringing in that qualitative experience of what a basic income could offer people, I think is a really exciting space. And the final thing I would just say is the global dimension of this is critical as well. So Scotland has been really excited to be seen as being a leader. We like, as a small innovative country, to feel that we're doing something quite, funky and we're at the forefront. We also don't like doing it on our own. We have this kind of tendency to be scared of being seen to be out on our own. So the fact that we can connect with colleagues in the US, in Canada, in Finland, across the world is a really exciting space, and it broadens out that evidence base that we have there. I think one of the most exciting aspects we've seen, I think there's more we could do about it, but one of the most exciting aspects we've seen over the last few years is that growth of these kind of events that we're having just now, the sharing of learning, of experiences, of challenges from around the world. And I think that is the critical aspect, because it shows, and we've seen this, the work you see from people like Ugo Gentili during lockdown shows that the main way governments are responding around the world is by giving money to people. That is now becoming the norm of the response. And I think through this shared global opportunities, we can enhance that. Yet here in Scotland, where we have a great political starting point, but also in other areas where perhaps it's been more challenging to get that initial momentum, as Amy said, reflects decades of really hard work and grit that's now coming to fruition.
Yeah, sure. Agree. So could we say that, controversial, but anyway, could we say that the wind is blowing in favor of basic income precisely because of COVID? Because COVID, it's demonstrating that a lot of concerns that people have, particularly on basic income, are just bullshit, all of them.
I would say COVID,
economic affordable results are not a disaster. There is no chaos across the streets, etc.
Yeah, COVID, first and foremost, COVID has been a human tragedy and the loss within that, but it has also been a potentially paradigm shifting moment. The talk about build back better. Now, the interesting way you can tell it could be a shift is because now the people who really don't want it to shift are using the language of change to try and get us back to where we were before. And that's usually a good sign that you're making progress. But this has been a fundamental shift. So I think COVID has, it's not that it's created the wind. I think the wind was there. I think we were moving in the direction. It has sped it up. And suddenly it's fully behind us in many, many contexts. Of course, it's not identical across the world, and we'll see different ways of progress. But I think when we get that one breakthrough, whether it's Scotland, whether it's Canada, whether it's the kind of experiments we're seeing across the US leading to maybe localized activity, that I think will break the gates, because suddenly it feels to me the one kind of argument that still gets thrown up that is harder to answer. We can answer the laziness, we can answer the cost, we can answer, it's that idea of, well, why has no one done this before? And I think we're right on the cusp that as soon as that happens, then I think that's a momentum shift that will be impossible to stop afterwards.
Yeah, but precisely because of that, precisely because we can answer all of the issues that, you know, public opinion or politicians or media has been posted against or concerned about basic income. And but even though, or precisely because of that, I'm still concerned about the potential labor market impacts, because, you know, the Finnish experiment was absolutely criticized by saying, okay, it doesn't, basic income doesn't work because people is not working more than they used to do. And in Barcelona, for instance, that the experiment has had a little bit media transcendence. The only media, the only notice, the only news I saw about the basic income experiment in Barcelona, it's one published a couple of weeks ago saying that, okay, the Be My Income project didn't work either because people is working less than they used to do before. And
So
this,
can I just ask a question
yeah,
on
and
that
this
though?
notice was published in the medium of the COVID crisis. So what's about the human chaos and the human losses that the pandemic has entailed? I mean, media is still interested, are only interested in the labor impact. So that's what I'm concerned about, the media impact of our experiments. Sorry, Amy, the floor is
No,
yours.
I was just going to say, I mean, I don't know, I can't speak for the context of Barcelona or Scotland in any way, shape or form, but for my context, if people have less labor market engagement because they have a guaranteed income, I don't care. I don't see that as a bad outcome, right? Because what we have in the United States are people who are laboring day after day in jobs that we know full well and have known for decades are eroding their health, their well-being, are, you know, destroying civic engagement, mattering hope. Like it's eroding civic engagement and community. And so if people have the opportunity to engage less with work that is not dignified and does not meet a human capability framework, to me, that's a win. Not a bad thing, right? So, you know, of course, they're not labor market findings from Stockton. It's a very tiny experiment, shows how individuals enacted with or engaged with a very small labor market of Stockton. We saw increases in full-time employment. Now, if you're looking at sort of the raw number of hours people were working, that kind of went down because we saw people going from underemployment or, you know, sort of part-time work, knitting together 2 and 3 part-time jobs where they're working 60 and 70 hours a week, but still can't make ends meet, to full-time employment, one job, which is healthier. You know, on the face of it, you could argue, well, you know, they're working less. Well, yeah, they are, but they're also, you know, they're working in a healthier space. And so to me, my role as a social scientist on this within the United States is to push the conversation and the data away from talking about labor market effects, because we get stuck there rather than starting with the point of saying, what type of country do we want to be? What do we want our social contract to look like? And what is that floor that we don't believe people should fall beneath? And so when we start first with that, the question of the floor and what the social contract should look like, and then from there step out and talk about the labor market, I'm all in on that, right? But getting stuck in sort of the conversation of labor market effects, that to me, and I like own my bias on this, that's just playing into these tropes around capitalism that we have swallowed for decades. And it's just sort of staying within that same frame, when in reality, what we're trying to do is to break that frame altogether, right? And say, who says it has to be this way? Budgets are moral documents. You know, I love what Jamie said, like sometimes there's a magical forest of trees, right? But yet there's not a magic forest of trees when we're talking about community. So when I think about kind of where we're at right now in the United States, the child tax credit that's being rolled out by the Biden administration is a form of guaranteed income. And it's the end result in many ways of all of the work that's been happening over many years. There's lots I could say about that, you know, won't go into it too much in detail, but I think it's going to be pretty hard to roll that back once people actually have that money in their pockets, because it's for the first time subsidizing the unpaid labor of women, which is the very thing that economy and society needs to continue growing. I'm not even just growing, just function on a basic level. But obviously I'm a little bit biased because I've been homeschooling my kids for 1.5 years because of COVID. So yeah, I have some feelings about it. I will totally own.
I think that's absolutely spot on. I mean, I think that's such an important call to arms, in that I think we do all fall into that trap of responding to what we're told we need to prove rather than proving what we need to prove. And I think, you know, that idea of pushing back against it, and this again is where we can learn globally from each other. I remember looking at the Finnish experiment and it was hysterical. The criticism before it was launched was, you can't do this because people will work less. And then when the results came out, they said, well, it's a failure because they didn't work more. So there was the change. There was the flip.
Good observation.
Yeah, why? And we, you know, I think, and again, maybe showing political bias here, but I think so many of the issues that we've seen where kind of populism and societal splits have come up in recent years have been because if you sit on the more kind of progressive side of things, you know, we kind of take for granted the good things. So I think with basic income, we have a habit of kind of, you know, we take for granted the good stuff that will come out of this instead of proactively framing the conversation in that way, saying to, you know, the people who are pushing back, well, why wouldn't you want to see the benefits that we know a basic income can bring? And here's the evidence that shows you that in place. And I think it can be challenging. Again, I am very lucky to be talking about that in a context where actually that has a resonance. Of course, you could be in a very different political context where that wouldn't be necessarily picked up on as much. And you can see there's, you know, shifts in the US just now that I'm imagining are making some of that a bit more open. But it allows us to change the debate and the discussion. And I think we have to be proactively doing that rather than simply responding to what we are told by the media or by politicians will be the only acceptable criteria, because those criteria will change every time we meet them.
Yeah, I see the point. Sure. Okay, let's move to the last question, because I would like to give room to the audience to raise some questions or to raise some or to interact with us. So here you are. Do you think that the experiments, the pilots we are conducting, or the ones we have already conducted in our cities, are more important in terms of being able to alter the policy debate, for instance, how social policy should be designed from now on, etc.? Or are they more important or relevant to advance the cause or the idea of basic income as such? I think that this question, or I see that this question could be a tricky one, because someone else could say, okay, Brew, that's a good question, but be aware that there is no an option of introducing basic income without previously discussing or redesigning welfare models or social policies in particular. So which would be the third, the third way, by saying, okay, the basic income through the back door. But do you think that even this, probably this possible tricky point, are the experiments more important for how they impact in discussing or rediscussing social policies and welfare, or are they more important in how they are able in advancing the basic income idea? I know that the difference could be a blur or a tricky one, but I would like to hear your opinion on that.
I mean, I don't see it as dichotomous. It's a great question, Brew. It's one that I sort of wrestle with a lot, and to me, it's both at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think you can have one without the other. So, again, I can only speak for my context. I don't want to, jump the gun and speak for somebody else's. But, sort of, we're at this moment in the United States where we have a policy and a public narrative window to get some form of unconditional cash transfer passed. However, that will close very, very quickly. History is a great teacher. And when we look back in the US at every sort of leap forward in the safety net or in the social contract, we know that it opens after a period of protracted economic decline and political unrest. But then it very quickly closes once the middle class and predominantly white folks recover from whatever that economic disaster was. So from where I sit as a social scientist, part of my role is making sure that first, the experiments that we're running are asking really sharp questions around implementation, feasibility, delivery mechanisms, how would these things actually work if they're implemented at scale, so that while that window is open, we are actually generating policy that is based on data, so that we're not creating new reproducible mechanisms of inequality. And so we have to, there's a really strong role for pilots to make sure that we're asking questions around feasibility and implementation. I don't believe in piloting just for pilot's sake. That's kind of foolish and not the best use of time or money. But we have to figure out how to actually build these delivery mechanisms before that policy window closes. And the thing that's going to keep that window open is making sure that we are engaging in mixed methods research and sort of multi-pronged efforts that are understanding people's experience, lived experience of the market, lived experience of poverty, lived experience of being involved in particular experiments or not, right? So that we are continuously engaging the public, because I'm no fool. I'm sitting in a pretty wonderful spot right now where everybody wants to talk to me about guaranteed income. That will not last, right? Give it 2 years and I will be back in academic conference spaces, talking to my peers, which I actually really love. That's kind of fantastic, right? But as the economy recovers and as the average household recovers, in all likelihood, if history is any teacher, and I believe that it is, that political window will close. So our job right now is to keep it at the forefront, pairing narrative with strong empirical data, so that when that policy is passed, and in my mind, the thing that's most likely in the US is a continuation of the child tax credit. It can be based on data and we can get it passed before this particular moment passes. And the reason it's crucial is because, we're living in an era of increased financialization, right? So right now it's COVID, 10 years ago was the Great Recession. 2 years from now, it's going to be a wildfire. It's going to be a hurricane. It's going to be climate change, right? So it's not just about COVID or this particular moment. It's figuring out, first of all, what do we want to be in terms of our social contract? But then 2, how do we insulate people against the risks that come with, in my mind, climate change, of course, but also the type of markets that we have in the US, which are just marked with risk. It's just a question of the scale of risk. Is it national? Is it local? What are you experiencing based on what population you're a part of? So probably a way longer winded answer than is necessary. But to me, it's really both things at the same time. And I don't think it's smart to do one without the other.
Yeah, I think that's excellent. I think that idea of the preparedness aspect, the basic income, not only, as you say, COVID for me hasn't created really new problems. It's just shone lights and brought to the forefront the problems that we knew were there and really kind of highlighted their impacts. So I think there's that element of basic income as a preparation for the future, for when we have another pandemic or we have those wildfires or climate change impacts. I think that gives it that longevity, because there is a risk. There was a lot of debate about emergency basic incomes in the early stages of the pandemic. And, in one sense, they would have been a fantastic step forward, and it would be very hard to take them back once you have them, but they're also run the risk of it being seen as just something you do in an emergency rather than an ongoing piece of work. But also, I agree with you. I think for me, it also raises the question. So it's the combination of the 2, as Amy said. I think it depends on the context you're in. Sometimes I think experiments and pilots are a barrier. So in Scotland just now, as I say, I think doing something large scale wouldn't make sense in terms of where we are. However, the work of the talking about pilots, even if we didn't deliver them, was actually a significant step forward. It added seriousness and research and collaboration. So I think they have a role within that. But also I think it plays into that idea of, and I know this again will be a split across basic income movement between, those who want to focus on the perfect basic income, or how much will we look at the kind of incremental stages towards a basic income. And I think that plays into seeing where you can grab those moments of opportunity. So if it is that, a child, we've had a child benefits payment in the UK, which effectively was a basic income for anyone who had children. Only recently has their degree of non-universality been brought into that for higher earners. Can we look at some of these areas of incremental change as well that start to keep that window at least propped open slightly, even if it's not as fully open as it is just now? I think the other thing that's been really fascinating here is, there's a great network across the UK called the UBI Lab Network, and they've started talking about basic income for the United Kingdom as this generation's NHS, National Health Service. And one of the arguments always made is people didn't pilot the National Health Service in the UK for years. They didn't say, let's roll out experiments and see what came with it. It was introduced, it was delivered. And I think it goes back to partly us shaping the agenda as well. and not allowing it always to be that, let's push it 5 years down the line, because the change and the impact that's needed is here. And it's really struck me that going into the Scottish parliamentary elections, where we knew we had this growing momentum and support across political parties and civic society, one of the areas that started to get discussed was the idea of a minimum income, which I know, again, there's so much crossover in how the terms are used and all the rest, but certainly in a Scottish context, my take on it is a slightly more traditional paternalistic, we'll just give it to the poorer people, and it keeps that element. Scotland is a very paternalistic country. We like telling people what to do across the political spectrum. And my concern there was it was a kind of nice way to put a dead end that didn't have to go as far as the full revolutionary impact of a basic income, but could seem like a nice positive step. What's been really promising, so the SNP, the Scottish National Party, is the main party of government, or the party of government in Scotland. Their manifesto has proposed that they will look to introduce a minimum income in Scotland over the next 5-year parliamentary term. However, it is very clearly rooted and described as a stepping stone towards a basic income, a full universal basic income, as the goal for Scotland. So it's seen as, because the other risk would have been brilliant political support. Yes, we want to introduce a basic income. We are fully committed, but we can't do it. So we're not going to talk about it for 5 years because we can't do anything about it. And that would have been understandable, but would have also lost that momentum. This idea that there can be an attempt at and there needs to be a lot of work around how you do that in a way that it doesn't become a dead end. But that idea of we're going to do what we can now, whilst not losing the ambition of that goal we want to get to, I think that creates a really exciting space for us, because it allows practical, iterative implementation while still retaining the bigger goal that most of us, I think, would like to see. So I think retaining that and seeing how that can look in different parts of the world as well is another space for learning and collaboration, I think.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I was totally aware that the question was a tricky one. That's my aim. So, but then you both would join the, how can I say, the incrementalist party concerning basic income. Therefore, I'm pretty agree with you, but there is always a but. I'm still concerned that while we are incrementing or moving forward basic income by tackling some some existing social policies, or improving some of them, or turning them more universal, etc., we get lost through the way, as the history has also demonstrated on other fights or claims or wherever. So I was concerning, and I was wondering how the 8 hours labor time was achieved 100 years ago here in Barcelona. They didn't join the incrementalist party. They instead were crashing the bourgeois heads until they get 8 hours a day of working. So I'm still in between both sides, the incrementalist side and the just in one fight to get the overall goal, which would be the full basic income. But anyway,
Yeah, well,
in any case, the debate is it's a very interesting one.
no, I like the way that you put that. One thing I'll just sort of throw out there is the reason why I believe that experimentation is important is because of feasibility. And so to me, the only goal, this is just, I can only speak for myself, is not just to pass a guaranteed income. Like, that's not my sole goal. That's only one step of the process. The bigger goal is having a social contract that is humane and that sort of pulls back forms of inequality that continue to lock people out. And if we do not dismantle that while we are passing guaranteed income, it's just going to migrate to something else. So to me, that's where my piece comes from, is sort of saying it's not just about basic income. I can pass basic income tomorrow. Guess what? We're still going to have racism destroying people's financial stability, access to markets and higher ed and healthcare and everything else, right? And so if you're coming at it from a social justice lens, it's not just about basic income. It's about basic income and human rights. So it's sort of it's like, I agree with you and I don't. I love your questions. I think they're absolutely fantastic. I don't get these ones very often, so it's very fun for me.
Okay, sorry, and thank you again. at the same time. Okay, if you think we could give the public a room, it's 6 o'clock in Barcelona. We have 20-30 minutes. So if anyone from the audience would raise some questions, some debate, or some issue that you consider that we are missing, just raise your hand.
Bru, we already have a question on the chat from Reinhard. He's asking, I don't know if he wants to ask, otherwise I'm going to read. Can Scotland test a basic income with local currency similar to South Korea and Marika in Brazil? What is the opinion of the speakers about basic income paid in local currency? Some say that it would be better for the local economy and more friendly for the environment. I also have a question, but I'll wait so others can ask their questions too.
Thanks, Shajaman. It's a really interesting one, and it has been raised in parts of Scotland about the idea of looking at local currency and avoiding money going to Amazon and reinvesting it in the local community. I think it's really interesting one. My concern, my kind of instinctive reaction I get to that raises me a slight concern, and this maybe goes back to the paternalism around in Scotland, is the degree to which that offers the freedom of choice to people receiving the income, or when it starts to run the risk of becoming a bit of a control. So I find in Scotland, we receive pushback on basic income from the left and the right, more from the left politically. That's partly because the left is traditionally bigger in Scotland, but also because that traditional top-down delivery side of the political left sees this as a real threat. And if you mention anything around freedom or personal choice, then the rest that you sound like Margaret Thatcher, which is not a good place to sound like in Scotland. It's quite dangerous. So I go on the basis that any talks I give, at the end of it, if I've been accused of being both a communist and a libertarian capitalist, then I've probably done a fair job over the course of the evening. But what you do find is that the biggest challenge is the unconditionality. That you get pushback around universality. Why would you give it to rich people? We can answer that. It's the unconditionality, because I have conversations with really forward-thinking, progressive, political figures or leaders in Scotland. He'll say to you, "I love this idea. It's brilliant, basic income." But I mean, obviously, we would expect people to be looking for work, wouldn't we, while they were receiving it? And you say, no, it's unconditional. There are no conditions attached to it. Well, we wouldn't let them spend it on, drink, would we, or alcohol, because that wouldn't be very good. We could only let them send it on, healthy food and veg. And I think, well, the Scottish economy would collapse if we didn't spend money on alcohol. It's what keeps us flowing. But also, it's that, no, there are not conditions. And that's my one concern. I'd love to know more. I must admit, I don't know enough about the examples from South Korea, for example, around how you protect that so it's seen as a positive way of investing in the local community rather than as a backhand way of control. And certainly knowing some of our folk here, I could see in very well-meaning ways how that would very quickly only be given to certain. So we had an example, Glasgow City Council, which is, is by and large a good administration. Beginning of COVID, they introduced some payments to people, but through the mechanics of setting it up, it was only agreed that you could spend it in certain shops. And those shops happened to be the shops that didn't sell alcohol, didn't sell certain products. And whether it was intended or not, it instantly looked like a degree of social control for the people who were, and it was very targeted support. So it was a certain part of society receiving it. So very long-winded way of saying, I do have a kind of concern around the control aspect of it, but if that could be a way of, as say the environmental, the local investment opportunities, then that could be an exciting space to look at.
I would agree. I don't have anything else to add to that. I think similarly.
Okay, interesting point. In Barcelona, we also introduced a local currency. Actually, the 25% of the cash benefit was paid in that digital local currency, which only local commerce business accept, not Walmart or the big supermarkets chains. And the experience was pretty good in quantitative terms in its impact, but also in the debate it raised, in the sense that I think that I'm not expert on that. I'm not economist either, but my intuition said that by introducing some local currency, although it could be interpreted or seen as a way of constrict people's freedom on how they want or how they prefer to spend their money. I think it's a quite interesting issue because it could erase or solve or overpass some critics with the basic income. Critics from the left, for instance, saying that, okay, the basic income is individualizator in the sense that you are granting people on individual ground. So yeah, that's true. But if the state or the government or the municipal government anyway, it's behind organizing or allocating the local currency, there is a room for saying, okay, we are introducing a same sort of basic income, but there is the public authority, let's say, still behind on it, because the public is administrating or are allocating some public funds. For instance, deciding that that 25 of the grant could not be spent on the big change, on the big outside the local businesses, for instance. So it's but I'm not sure. I'm not pretty sure about the answer.
I think it just shows to me, again, though, how critical that these policies and experiments are created with real people. That, with no disrespect to any of us doing this, that we're also engaging with communities, that we're bringing them in rather than just producing a policy at the end of it that says, here's something we've decided for you. Because that natural tendency, we talked about Amy talked about the window closing. The window closing because middle class gets comfortable again, and we don't need to think about social justice quite as much because we're okay. We did, when we published our report, Basic Income for Scotland, which laid out the ideas for how you could deliver a basic income in Scotland. We did on the ground work with some folk in Fife, and I remember being at a community session where we were talking to people and we were asking them, try and imagine what would you do? What difference could a basic income make to your life? And I always remember a woman who was participating said, I'm really sorry to say this, and you don't have to record it because I know it's not what you're going to be looking for, which was telling in itself. She said, but one of the things I would do with the basic income is that every so often on a Friday night, I would buy a Chinese takeaway for my family and I, so I didn't have to cook and I didn't have to wash the dishes, and we could just spend time together. And she was ashamed to tell us. And to me, this was a fantastic opportunity. After we finish tonight, I'm having a pizza with my kids because I can, because we wouldn't think twice about it. This was seen as some sort of shame rather than as an opportunity for her to make a choice that benefited her. And I think we do have to be very careful about that well-meaning decision-making for people. For me, basic income is first and foremost about trust. It's about restoring trust in society. That's what came out of the Finnish experiments. The participants trusted each other more, they trusted society more. And I've never understood this dichotomy between you're for the state or you're for individuals. It makes no sense to me. Basic income answers that. You only have a basic income because we're part of something bigger. But you get the choices that you're able to make for you, your family, your communities. And I think it maybe plays back to that idea of, and I know it sounds idealistic at points or naive, because of course we have, politics is the art of possible. We have to go with what's the narratives are and so on. But the more we allow that to be decided for us, I think the more we limit the policy. So if we limit it to being, well, the local authority has to decide how people can use some of that money because it'll keep the left happy that we're allowing state control still in this. I really, that's where I worry about it. And I think we have to push back a bit and show actually when you trust people, unsurprisingly, they return that trust and they make use of that. And that's what we see across all the experiments that have taken place.
Yeah, that's my concern too. Okay, Katerina, she was telling me that there is a couple of questions waiting for, there is the one from Andreu. Would you like to read the Andreu comment?
Yes, sure.
Comment, not a question, actually. Or
it's a comment and a question. So he's saying that 150 years ago, many criticized universal suffrage. Everybody agrees on it today. On 150 years from now, they'll look back at us and see our critics as we now look at the critics of universal suffrage. Hopefully, Andrew. So he's asking, universal suffrage was not piloted. A real UBI cannot be piloted, but experiments are welcome. And then question. His question is, what other parallelisms do you see between a UBI and the issue of universal suffrage? We also have afterwards Carl Witherspoon. We also have campaign wanting to make a question, and again I also want to make one. So I don't know how you prefer, Brew. Should we take on this question from Andreo now, or should we take Brew, Amy, and Jamie, or should we take more questions and then Brew and Amy can answer? Brew, Jamie, and Amy can answer.
I would prefer checking whether there is any other questions from the public. There is this from Andreo. Carl raised his hand.
And we have Carl Witherspoon.
And we have someone from Vietnam who also raised the hand. So we could concentrate 3 questions, 3-4 last questions, because it's 20 minutes to finish the meeting. So I would like to concentrate these 3 or 4 last questions. The Andreu. So Carl, the room is yours. And then someone from Vietnam, from Namibia. Hi, Carl.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Thanks for calling on me. Amy, I was very happy to hear what you were saying about the empowerment of individuals. You believe includes this power to decide that the available employment options might not be good enough for them. And this is really why I think it's really not so much about trust but respect. Well, because trust could be implied, well, we trust that if we leave people free to do stuff, they're going to do the stuff that we think is best. And the stuff that we think is best for the lower classes is often wrong because we don't understand their circumstances. And often what they need to do is to reject these really crappy jobs that we, the more privileged, has been offering them for hundreds of years. But I think this is really one of the great dangers of experiments. I think experiments have a lot of value, but they don't measure this empowerment well because they don't measure what happens next. As you said, they don't measure the market effects. They only measure the immediate individual effects. And they tend to call attention to the things that they measure well. And what they measure well is how many hours. One of the things they can most easily measure is how many hours did the experimental group work and how many hours did the control group work. And they draw people's attention on that, and then they're immediately, that makes them easily subject to demagoguery, who people will say, aha, the experimental group worked 0.5% less than the control group. This experiment didn't work. This is a horrible thing. We need to reject it. And even though this result didn't happen in Stockton, I think I was really disappointed with how the results were rolled out, at least by Mayor Michael Tubbs, that he called enormous attention to the fact that the control group and experimental group worked about the same. Maybe the experimental group even worked a little more. And he portrayed this as a really good thing, when this might not have been so true if the amount had been higher. And it also produced that any other experiment with a higher basic income that's likely to find it, he's handing them this idea, he's buying into this rhetoric that if in fact the people had not worked more, it would be a terrible thing. And so my question for you is, you're doing all these follow-up experiments. Since you and I feel the same way about this, are you going to be able to control that rhetoric a little more and focus the attention on the other, I think, more important aspects? Did it help with the nutrition of children? Did it help with the educational attainment of children? Did it really empower the parents in meaningful ways? And what are you going to do to compact this just continual focus on what we both agree is really not an important effect at all?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And we've said this, we meaning Dr. West and myself, at various times in public forums and also in the press, that so employment it was not a primary outcome of our experiment. It wasn't even a hypothesis. we were asking as part of sort of like just the standard things that you ask in a social science experiment. And we really wrestled internally with whether or not to even share that finding out for exactly the reasons you point out. As we said, we have phenomenal data on our primary outcomes, which revolved around income volatility, anxiety, depression, and well-being. Like that's really what it was about. And, you know, our fear was, and some of this was borne out, was that if we talk about the change in employment, it's going to distract from the more primary outcomes, which have to do with being human. And sort of where we ended up landing with it was releasing it out of a commitment to transparency, simply because, you know, when we're working in a public experiment the way that we felt kind of beholden to report on what we found. And obviously we're not done running analysis yet. So as far as what we're going to do in the future, you're right to ask. It sort of keeps me up at night. You know, within the center that we're running at Penn, we have a large number of experiments in our portfolio. They're going to be unrolling over the next year. Some are attached in some way to a sort of a city, and some are not. And they all kind of have different aims. But that's really the struggle. And I will own that I haven't figured it out yet. You know, it's sort of, that's the danger, is when you do public science and you put those numbers out there, right? You don't know how a mayor is going to talk about it. You don't know how a senator is going to talk about it. You don't know what's going to happen in the press. And it's, sometimes it goes well and sometimes it doesn't. You know, I think part of what our role is of course being transparent, number one, but number two, consistently drawing attention to the other findings, which I think matter a whole lot more. And the last thing I want to do is to continue to play into this narrative that it's about labor market effects, because I don't think that it is. That's not the point. But yeah, I mean, that really is the risk that we run. I'll say the thing that I'm most encouraged about is that the other politicians who are working with us around guaranteed income experiments have been leaning from the very beginning into sort of anti-Black, like these tropes around anti-Blackness, these tropes around poverty in a much more robust way than I've seen in the past. So I'm pretty hopeful that people will, you know, as we're reporting on findings as they come out, will be a little bit more of a well-rounded conversation. But yeah, I mean, that's the risk of public engagement, right? And it's sort of, we had a choice at the beginning of this experiment, you know, do we huddle in our offices the way I want to, frankly, as an academic? I'm so used to my research decisions being made in private, not being like sort of out there in the public space, but sort of feeling this tension of a responsibility to have public engagement around it. But you are totally right. There's this risk of what's going to happen. Like, you can't control things once they're put out there. So I'm all ears from you and from others as to how we think about these things moving forward. We're of course several years out from reporting on these other experiments, but I think it's crucial. Like, you can't, once it's out of your hands and it's out there, and politicians are going to say what they're going to say.
Yeah. Well, can I follow up?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, it's two-part. One thing, I was just so disappointed by Michael Tibbs, who was instrumental in creating the first basic income experiment, that I thought he would, you know a little more about the political background to this, because one of the things I've been very skeptical about this new round of experiments, but one of my hopes for this new round of experiments is that with the experiments from the 1970s, is that the researchers who are conducting these all around the world are more aware of this issue and more aware of this streetlight effect of it attracting that experiments can attract your attention to the wrong thing, that they're going to try to keep the focus on the more important things. The direct effects of this is, how does it help the welfare of people? And I was just so disappointed that this is hugely instrumental figure was going back to that 1970s trap that I'm sure you know the history of the 70s experiments. They were blindsided then, and they had no way to know, but now we should know better. Was going back to that 1970s trap.
Oh, it's just an echo.
Yeah, some weird echo. Okay, I'm done. I've talked too much already.
Okay, there is a raised hand from someone from Namibia. let's give him
Yes.
room.
Okay. Thank you so much for the opportunity. This is really great. I'm really happy that I've nearly brushed shoulders with Carl, who's been,
welcome.
Very instrumental with the whole basic income grant issue in Namibia. He's advised the Bank of Namibia on how BIG could be implemented and all that kind of stuff. I'm really glad. Yes, I'm Renani, and I'm from the Basic Income Grant Coalition. You call it UBI. In other countries, we call it the BIG, which is the Basic Income Grant. You don't have the grant at the end of your name. We have struggled for many years. I would say 18 years now to get the basic income grant, understood by the politicians. I really envy Scotland and America to some extent, that they have, support for the whole concept from their local politicians. It's completely different in Namibia. It was in 2002 that the government appointed a commission to see how poverty could be reduced in Namibia, and also see what kind of tax reforms could be made. And the commission suggested to the government that the basic income grant would be the best thing to quickly reduce poverty. And the president then came back and said, no, this is going to make people lazy. And then we, out of our own effort at the coalition in Namibia, collected money from mainly Germany. The churches in Germany provided money so we could run a basic income grant pilot study in a small settlement just outside the capital city here, which worked really well. It was validated by local and international scientists. So we've got good evidence from that pilot study that basic income grant would be a really good thing, and it would have various impacts on society, economic, more children go to school, malnutrition decreased, crime, and all those other things you can mention. All those aspects that we had to convince the politicians with, that they should implement BIG, but that didn't work, unfortunately. So we've been really struggling, and we've been really frustrated on how we can make people understand. And then the problem that we have now is that we have economists in our country who keeps coming, with excuses that the country cannot afford basic income grant at this stage because of the economic state of the country due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And then we all over again have to attack that and give them calculations on how much we think it's going to cost. And it's just a constant fight. And finally, we have come to that point where the president felt a bit under pressure to go like, okay, I accept that we need basic income grant, but we're only going to give it to people who previously were receiving support from the food bank, which means that that's only 42,000 people in Namibia that he says should be getting the basic income grant. So he wants to convert the food bank into basic income grant, and only 42,000 Namibians will benefit. And we go like, no, this is not what we wanted. We wanted universal. And he goes like, no, why should I give money to people that don't need the money? And we go like, just to make sure that you don't exclude the people that would really need the basic income grant the most, because they would, naturally be excluded from accessing the services if you add more administration to the whole process. So that's where we are stuck at the moment. We are struggling to make them understand that you can make it universal. And if you feel like they are high earners, all that you do is just adjust the tax code of that specific population that you feel are high earners. They just don't seem to get that. And Namibia is really good when it comes to collecting taxes. We are like 31% over the global average. So adjusting people's tax codes wouldn't be such a big issue at all. So now we are stuck there with making them understand that universality is the best. But we're asking actually just for the ages between 19 and 59, because those ages don't have any social protection cover at all. and we're asking for 500 Namibian dollars, which is not really much at all. You can only buy a handful of, basic food with it. So we've decided that we've spoken enough with politicians. Now we need to mobilize the people on the ground, and we are struggling with that because we don't have resources. Namibia doesn't get much funding anymore since we were, rated upper higher middle income class, to call it. So I would really like some advice from the group, which I'm really learning a lot from that. How do we mobilize people? The people doesn't seem to understand the concept. People are really struggling, and we're struggling to make them understand. How do we mobilize the masses? How do we make them understand? And on top of that, how do we make the politicians understand that making it unconditional would be the best thing? Thank you.
Thank you too. I'm afraid to hear that this is one of the dangers we were considering before, about the dangers of incrementalism. They say, okay, we are going to introduce the basic income, but first, let's prioritize those who are receiving food stamps or are beneficiaries of food banks, etc. Unfortunately, I have no magic receipts to offer you the how to create a coalition to force your government to introduce basic income. In any case, there were a couple of questions remaining. Well, there was the Andreu question about the suffrage. I lost the question here.
Well, while we're looking for questions, just wanted to respond quickly to that last question. I think sort of it's hard to say because I don't know your context, but one of the things that I know is that where we sit right now in the United States around guaranteed income wouldn't be possible without being connected to other forms of activism. So yes, we have the pandemic. Yes, we've had, consistent advocacy around UBI for many, many decades, but we're also living through a moment of political unrest where the organizing that persists around Black Lives Matter is opening up public conversation for questioning the real givenness or the assumptions around the way that society is sort of knit together, the way that the market is knit together. And so to me, trying to advocate for change around one narrow thing can be really difficult if we're not at least aware of what's happening in the broader space with organizing and looking for those spaces where you have coalition building across political and policy silos. So it's not just about a single issue. Because we are benefiting on this so much in the United States right now because people are ready to talk about justice because their eyes are opened because of what's been happening with Black Lives Matter. And so that gives us entree to have a bigger conversation about economic justice at the same time.
I think that's spot on. And again,
thank you.
I don't know the context. I would love to. I'd love to continue this conversation because I think it sounds a fascinating space. And as I say, that global connectivity is important, so very happy to get in touch afterwards if that's useful. A few things I would say from my context that may or may not have relevance, and I think Amy's laying out there was really important around that, linking it to other areas, because if it is just one policy on its own, it lacks that transformative ability of being a foundation to the social contract. I think a few things we've seen. So one is it's about the ownership of this. And this goes back to where it's, we'll just give it to people who are receiving food bank money or support. This money that, is so difficult to find, it's not, the money doesn't belong to the government or doesn't belong to the politicians in power. It's money that belongs to society, it's created in society. And I think once people start to feel an ownership of that and a connectivity into the system, then suddenly the idea they should be getting something back from that seems more important. So I think there's something around challenging these narratives around, the economy is separate to us, and maybe we will be lucky and be beneficiaries of a bit of, support where it's really, really necessary, as opposed to being actively engaged and contributors and recipients. I think can start to change that perception of your relationship with the state and with the economy. I think as well, one of the things I find with policy in general recently, and this is within a Scottish context, but I think is quite common in a lot of places, is that policy tends to be a yes or no, for or against. So we'll give you an idea. Do you support it or do you not support it? And you have to make quite a quick decision as to where you stand, quite often without all the full evidence. And then you get put in a camp of those in favour, those against. And we've seen through social media and so on that you end up in a kind of, you know, echo chamber of other people who share that opinion. One of the things we find about basic income in Scotland, certainly, has been giving people chance to just play with the idea. So you don't have to instantly say you're for or against. You can be in favour or open to basic income, but also have concerns. You can be opposed to basic income, but see where some of the benefits come or some of the questions that are being raised are valid. And when you give people that chance to play with it, to think about context and so on, people really start to engage with that in a much stronger way. And that's where I think we've seen that civic engagement. You know, groups where we've seen, and some of this is, you know, recognising where privilege comes into play or where fear of change and how that might impact upon you comes into play. One of the areas we've had challenges in Scotland is around anti-poverty campaigners and organisations, because there's a bit of a threat of, well, they know how they work and they're very concerned about quite clearly reducing poverty. And is this going to distract from the attention of, and it, you know, Bruce points about incrementalism. I would say actually a lot of the time, it's a lot of the poverty charities are quite incrementalist, because if you can at least make a little bit more progress, why would you risk it with something big and dangerous? But when you bring people in and you give them that space to actually raise their concerns and be listened to, I think that starts to change some of the dialogue as well. And I think just going back to what we've said throughout all of our examples here from the US, from Spain, from Scotland, you know, having this led by people and bringing politicians with you rather than expecting politicians to deliver it, I think makes the fundamental change. So where can you find those community activists who are actually going to be working in a lot of these really critical areas and allow them to drive the energy? That's when you start to connect into those areas that Amy highlighted around wider change and progress and equity.
That's the point. Okay, thank you all. I don't know if there is some.
I just have to log off, Brew, just because I have to go to a medical appointment. I apologize. I just wanted to note, I think it was Andrew who dropped a question.
You to finish the session at
yes, I just dropped an answer in the chat, and I'm going to go ahead and log off. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Amy. That was fantastic.
Thank you.
I would like to thank Amy's participation and Jamie's as well too. I would like to thanks to all the audience joining us this afternoon, all your questions. Most of them we haven't have time enough to answer properly. For instance, the ones regarding the local currencies that I'm surprised that are raising so many discussions. This is a very interesting point. In any case, I think that we all have learned a lot from this session. We hope to see you soon in the next webinar, which will take place in July, the end of July, something like that. And otherwise, we're waiting for you in Braga in the next July, which hopefully we could meet each other personally and to have a room to discuss all and other questions in more detail. Thank you, all of you, once again, and see you soon, hopefully.
Thanks for organising, Brew and Katerina. It was fantastic as always.
Thank you.
Thank you. To the woman from the Namibia campaign, I had sent some direct messages to you. I don't know if you saw them, but they're there.